Good evening and welcome. Thank you very much for attending this presentation tonight. My name is Ann Heidoff. I am the Elementary Assistant Principal and I am Chair of the Harlan Community School District Health and Wellness Committee. Our Health and Wellness Committee has been privileged to partner with Myrtue Medical Center to bring you Iowa State Professor Dr. Gentile. Dr. Gentile shared his research this morning with our middle school students and staff, this afternoon with our high school students and staff, and now tonight we get the privilege of having him share his information and research with us, our community. What we'll do is we'll have a presentation and we can do questions at the end. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Gentile.
Thank you so much. So, I study media's influences on children, adolescents, and adults. And there are lots of opinions out there. And where do you get your information from? Oh, you get it from the media. That's interesting. Do you expect you're going to get, the science from the media, or are you going to get more opinion? Well, it's a mix. And how can we tell kind of the fact from the fiction? Well, here's where science can help. It can help us know which opinions we should be paying attention to, which ones actually have data backing them up. So tonight I'm going to be talking about lots of data and why we should even be paying attention to this. Aren't media just entertainment? Aren't they just information for us? Well, no, that's how we use them. We use them to be entertained. We use them to be informed. But that's not actually what they think they're trying to do. And what power do they actually have? Well, I'll tell you a story. In Mexico in the 1970s, there was a terrible problem with adult illiteracy. Too many adults couldn't read, and the government realized that they wanted their economy to grow, they needed to do something to change that. So they instituted, over the times, really innovative programs. They put adult literacy classrooms right in the workplace, for example. So you could go before work, or on your lunch break, or after work. They provided child care in many cases, which, as you know, is very important. If we want you to come to a thing, we need to make sure that we can take care of your kids so that you have a chance to learn something new. They provided monetary incentives in many cases. Usually it's a powerful incentive for people, right? Well, no one went. Okay, why not? Well, it wasn't cool to admit I can't read. No one wanted to be seen walking in that door, right? So the producer of the most popular soap opera in Mexico, Miguel Sabido, decided to try a little experiment. For 6 months, he wove pro-adult literacy messages into his soap opera. In the year following that little experiment, adult literacy enrollments went up 800%. There's the power of the media. It changed the culture. From, it's not cool to admit I can't read, to, it's cool to say I can't read and I'm going to do something about it. So we're talking about the power of the media. We're not just talking about its power on you individually when we're watching it, or your kids when they're watching it, although it certainly has big power and influence there. But we're actually talking more broadly, how it changes your community, how it changes the culture altogether. So let's start with a few basic statistics, get us all on the same page. 99% of American households have TV sets. That's more than have running water. Shows you our priorities, right? The average house in America now has 25 internet-connected devices in it. That's just the average. That means half or more. When we look in children's bedrooms, 30% of babies have TVs in their bedrooms, 40% of preschoolers, and over 2/3 of age now have TVs in their bedrooms. Now, developmental psychologists like myself, we love to make up technical terms to describe psychological phenomena. We have a very specific technical term to describe this. This is what's known in developmental psychology as a bad idea. Now, that sounds like an opinion. I told you I'm going to tell you about science. Well, I'll get to some of the science on that. Here's part of it. If we look at how kids are spending their time, the average American school-age child spends half an hour a week actively engaged one-on-one with his or her father. That's not just in the same room as the father, that's actively engaged in some activity or another. The average American school-age child spends half an hour or 2.5 hours a week actively engaged one-on-one with his mother, 4 hours a week doing homework, a half-hour a week doing non-school related reading, and that may be a generous number. When I told this to the teachers, they said, oh yeah, that's generous. Most kids aren't even doing that much. 10 hours a week on the computer, not for school purposes. 13 hours a week playing video games. There's a big sex difference here. Boys, it's up about 18, 19 hours a week. The girls are down about 8 or 9 hours a week. And watching TV and videos has now crept back up over 30 hours a week. Now, I have no doubt parents matter. You're not getting equal time. You're not getting anything close to equal time. You add that up, that's 54 hours a week. The average American school-age child's in front of the screen, not for school purposes. That's a full-time job plus 14 hours of overtime. Now, what's really changed in the past decade is about a third of the time they're on one screen, they're on another screen too. And it turns out that's really bad for your brain. You've been watching TV for 5 hours. Turn it off right now and play your video games for a while. People are often saying things like, oh, it's so much worse now than it used to be. I think you should always be skeptical anytime someone says that, and demand the data. So I looked at the data. In 1950, there were 168 hours in the week. That hasn't changed. Thank God we never went metric. Who knows what it would be? Now we know what metric hours are like. Now, if we assume, and it's not a totally correct assumption, but if we assume that kids are getting 7 hours of sleep a night, which is too little, the data seem to show they need 9 to 10 hours a week or a night. But and if we think of all their personal care, bathing, eating, things like that, maybe 3 hours a day, and school is 30 hours a week, that left 68 hours a week open for everything else. Now, what do I mean by everything else? I mean going to church, spending time with family, spending time with friends, doing homework, reading, having hobbies, playing sports, being in clubs, learning an instrument. Anything else has to fit into that remaining 68 hours a week. And in 1950, that is how many hours kids actually had for that. Over time, TV has crept into it, and video games more, and computers more, and now the average American school-age child has only 14 hours a week to do anything of value. It really has changed. And notice, actually, that's not even counting their time with phones. That's too new. We don't have good numbers on it yet to tell you how much that's adding to this. So in fact, it's actually probably way less than that. So I said that all the screen time is probably not so good for your kids. Well, and I said that multitasking, watching 2 screens at once, especially bad. I used to have parents come up to me and say, you know, my kids have ADHD, and the only thing he can pay attention to for 2 hours at a time is video games. And I went, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. Let's do a study and find out. So, in this study, this is a longitudinal study. We, 1,300 third and fifth graders, we followed them across 2 school years, so a year apart basically. And what we find is that if kids are spending more time with TV and video games or screen media, they do seem to have a higher percentage of attention problems. Now, attention problems in this case is rated by teachers. So it's what the teachers actually see in the classroom. Now, it's not the same teacher from year 1 to year 2 because these are 3rd through 5th graders, so they move up a grade. But those are highly correlated. What one teacher sees one year, the next teacher sees the next year too. Those are very, so attention problems tend to be pretty stable. But what was really surprising here is if they spend a lot of time watching TV and video games last year, their attention problems are worse the next year. We have spent the past 40 years talking about attention problems, mostly from the biological aspect. We haven't really looked at what's in the environment that might be causing these problems. Here's another study with 3,000 children, 3rd through 8th graders, and watching them across a year. And what we see is that if they have more attention problems in 1 year, next year, this is a study focused mostly on video games, next year they're spending more time with video games, because that makes sense. If you've already got attention problems and something that's constantly flashing and beeping at you, that kind of fits your cognitive style. So kids with attention problems seek out more of the media. But what we also see is a significant effect that as they're consuming more violent games, or not violent games, it's just video game exposure, they are having more attention problems. So what we're seeing here is a negative spiral. Now, why is that? Well, we don't really know. But I have some hypotheses about it. I think that attention might be something like a muscle. That as you use it, it gets stronger, and if you're not using it very much, it will actually get weaker and atrophy. And TV and video games and social media and most screen media are kind of like crutches, right? If you stand outside someone's house when they're watching TV or something, what do you see? You see a constant flickering. Every time the light flickers, we have to look. It's a low brain survival mechanism called the oriented response. If you're keeping track in your psychological jargon scorecards tonight, we'll see who gets bingo by the end of the night. And a good survival value for this. If a shadow crosses you, you'd better look at it. It might be about to eat you, right? So we have to look when a light flickers. If you're sitting in the next room and listening to someone playing video games or watching TV, what do you hear? Well, you're going to hear the sound get loud, then quiet. You're going to hear sound effects. You're going to hear things that pop in, right? Anytime the sound changes, we have to look. Again, good survival value for this. If a twig snaps behind you, you better turn and look at it, right? So basically, the media are kind of like those bumpers at the bowling alley. They're keeping your attention going this way by constantly triggering your oriented responses. So it's like being on crutches. You're not having to pay the attention. You're not having to spend the attention. You're not having to effort attention. It's sucking it out of you. And the more time you spend with it, the weaker your attentional muscle gets, because you're staying on the crutches, rather than actually efforting it and making that attentional muscle stronger. Why should you care about this? Well, we've spent the past 40 years looking at the biological reasons for attention problems, and what that has gotten us is some really good medications. But the problem is when your teacher calls you up and says, Johnny's having trouble paying attention in school, you're left feeling stuck, like the only option you have is to medicate your child. That shouldn't have to be your only option. So data like this that are starting to look at the environmental aspects give you a first step to try. Cut back their screen time, and maybe that'll be enough. Maybe you'll still need to medicate, but at least you've now got another tool in your bag rather than just being forced to have to medicate your child. So I'll tell you about a little pseudo study I did in my Psych 101 class at Iowa State. This is the room that I used to teach in. It's a giant 400-person stadium seating room. If you went to Iowa State, it's Gildee Hall, 125 Rush Auditorium. And when I walk in, every day I say, turn off your phones and put them away. I don't say put them down. I don't say put them on silent. I say turn them off and put them away. Do they? No, of course they don't. They leave them out on their desk. So about halfway through this semester, I give them a little survey. I ask them, how often do you check your text messages or social media during a class? And the scale goes from the low end that I never do it in any classes, to maybe I do it once or twice in some classes, but not all, to the high end of the scale is I usually check it 1 or 2 times per class. So let's think about that kid checking their text messages or their social media. They're either glance down at their phone or they open up another window on their laptop. They don't think they're losing anything, right? Because they're still listening to me. They can see that the PowerPoint hasn't changed. So they're just glancing down, checking to see if there's a message that maybe they should respond to. So they're not losing anything. Wrong. I then correlate with their actual grades. If they never check their text messages or social media in class, the average grade they're getting is a B. If they do it just a couple of times a class period, they lose 2 level grades. They think they're losing nothing. Oh, they're losing a lot. So, parents, I would recommend that you lobby the school board and the admin team to make your schools phone free. Now, what do I mean by phone free? Doesn't mean they can't have a phone at school, although, you know, most of the reasons parents give for this are really stupid. Oh, what if I need to get in touch with them? There are other phones at school, and the school knows where your kid is, so you just need to call the office and they'll find your kid and get them on the phone for you. The teachers could take all the phones, put them in the bag. At the beginning of class, they pick them up on their way out the door. I mean, there are lots of ways to do this that don't lead to all these distractions. Now, why does this effect happen? Well, there's an interesting brain story in here. We believe that we're good multitaskers. We believe that we need to multitask in our jobs or in our schooling. Many of us actually feel like we're really good at it. It turns out, if you feel you're good at it, you actually are terrible at it. And the more you do it, the worse you get. Isn't that interesting? Well, that doesn't make sense, right? The more you do something, you should get better at it. So what are you really doing? Well, the brain is not a multitasker. Unless by multitask we mean that you can listen to me and digest your food. You are doing that, right? That is multitasking. But you can't actually listen to 2 things at once. And you can't actually process 2 different linguistic things at once. So if you glance down at your phone to look at your text message, your brain is a multi-switcher. It's very good at switching from one thing to the next. But when I'm looking here, I can't be looking there. And when I'm looking here, I can't be looking there. So we're good at switching. And a classic study was done at Stanford by Clifford Nass. He had students come in, students are high-functioning Stanford undergraduates, right? They asked them how much do they multitask in a day, how good do they think they are at it, how much do they feel they need to do it to be successful, things like that. And then he gave them a task where they actually had to multitask. And the more they did it in the real world, the worse they were at it when they had to do it. The better they thought they were, the worse they really were. Why? Because what we're really training is being distractible. When you multitask, that's the thing that the brain gets good at. Noticing little differences and quickly reorienting your attention. But every time you reorient your attention, there's a little time lag in just the reorienting, and then there's another time lag when you have to kind of re-remember what is happening over here and re-engage with it. And so the more you switch, the more time you waste, and the harder your brain works. And this is why you think you're good at multitasking, because it feels hard. You do get tired doing it because your brain is working hard, but it's actually making you worse at whatever you're doing. So we did a little experiment. One of my graduate students, Ella Falpower, did this where she recruited Iowa State students, and she randomly assigned them to 1 of 2 conditions. Either just keep using your phone and social media like normal, however you do, or she asked half of them to cut back to 30 minutes a day. Now, she didn't require it. It's not like we put a lockdown on their phones or something, but we asked them to self-monitor and bring it down to 30 minutes a day. And we measured a whole bunch of things about their psychological wellness, their positive emotions, their negative emotions, their fear of missing out, their anxiety, loneliness, depression. Turns out Iowa State students have a lot of anxiety and have a lot of depression and have a lot of loneliness, they report. And this is post-COVID, so people, all these numbers have gone up in the country and they've stayed pretty high. They are not absolutely good levels, but they stayed much higher than they used to be before COVID. So that epidemic of anxiety and depression that you're reading about is true. So, if we think about why people look at social media so much, well, one of the reasons is to mitigate their loneliness, right? Because they feel connected to people on it. Another is the fear of missing out, because they worry if they're not on, they're going to miss something important. So if we ask them to reduce to 30 minutes a day, wouldn't you expect those to go up? Their loneliness should go up, and their fear of missing out should go up, and maybe they'll get more anxious because now they're feeling more lonely and all that. Well, that's not at all what we found. We found exactly the opposite. If they limited it down to 30 minutes a day, they were lower in anxiety, lower in depression, lower in fear of missing out, lower in loneliness, lower in negative emotions, and higher in positive emotions. Isn't that kind of cool? So here's a very simple thing you can do to reduce your anxiety is actually cut back. It's not intuitive. We think that we're using it to actually help ourselves cope with our anxiety. We use it, we think we're making ourselves less lonely. No, every time you're staring at the screen, you're less engaged with the world. That's why it's called a medium. You're putting it between you and the real world. And so we feel less connected the more time we spend on it. It's not what we think we feel. But when we measure it correctly, that's what we actually are finding. I'm not quite sure why I put this one in here, but I told this to your middle schooler, so I'll tell it to you. Once again, back to what's the power of the media? How effective are the media at influencing us without our conscious awareness? And I want you to imagine that rather than parents here in the Harlan School District, we are an advertising agency. And I've asked you down here to our fantastic conference room because we've got a super new client and we've got to come up with a terrific ad campaign for them. And our new client is cigarettes. Do we have an easy job? No. We have at least 4 problems to overcome, or 5 problems to overcome. First of all, do you have an inherently attractive product? No, it stains your teeth, gives you bad breath, people tell you it's going to kill you. It's not usually something you look for in a product, right? You don't go down to Target and say, I wish these shampoos will kill me more, right? Okay, that's fine, we're pros, we can overcome that problem. What's the second problem? Well, the 2 most powerful media, radio and television, are banned from your use. You cannot advertise the 2 best ways there are to advertise. That makes it a lot harder. All right, what's problem number 3? Well, your product, when used as directed, kills 400,000 people a year. You've got to get 400,000 new customers a year just to stay even. Ooh, that's a lot harder. Problem number 4, well, research shows that only 1 out of 5 adult smokers began as an adult. If you flip that around, it suggests you only have a 20% chance of hooking adults. You've got a much better chance of hooking kids. Well, there's problem number 5. Is it legal to market your product to kids? No. So you don't have an inherently attractive product. You can't advertise the 2 best ways there are to advertise. You've got to get 400,000 new customers a year just to stay even. You've got to market cigarettes to children, but it's illegal to do that. This graph shows estimated sales of Camel cigarettes to children. In January of 1988, it was estimated $6 million worth of Camel cigarettes were sold to children. By July of 1989, that number had risen to $476 million. Anyone remember what happened in this intervening 18 months? Joe Camel, yep. A cartoon character who smokes. Hey kids, smoking's cool. Now, I said at the beginning, having a TV in the bedroom or media in the bedroom was a bad idea. On what evidence do I base this? So here's one of our studies. This is with 3 large longitudinal samples in multiple countries, by which I mean thousands of kids in these studies. And if we think about whether TV or video games or media in the bedroom, what effects might they have? Well, there are kind of 2 paths we could imagine. We could imagine that one of the ways it has an effect is by what your child's not doing. Right? Every minute they're on media, they're not reading, they're not exploring, they're not creating. They're not doing all sorts of other things that might have benefit. So that's called the displacement hypothesis, that TV or video games are displacing other things that might have more benefit, and so one of the things they might do is displace physical activity so that your child is higher risk for obesity. They're not reading, they're not doing as much homework, so maybe they'll have poorer grades, and they're spending so much time with it that they might actually start getting addicted to video games or the media. That's what these symptoms, internet gaming disorder symptoms. The other side is the content hypothesis, that if they're consuming, say, aggressive media or violent media, that might lead to greater willingness to behave physically aggressively in the real world. And why does it do this? Well, you might say that they're going to have more screen time if there are media in the bedroom, and they might consume more violent content. But it gets even more complicated than that, is that in fact we can see that Perhaps they're reading less, and this is year 1, year 2, year 3, basically, although they're not always a year. Some of the samples are like 6 months apart. But 3 waves of data collection. They're getting less sleep, which also is really bad for kids. It's bad for you too, as adults. Sleep is tremendously necessary for all sorts of health and wellness issues and brain function. And if they're consuming more violent content, they might have what is known, here's your next psychological jargon, normative beliefs about aggression. This is how acceptable you find it to behave aggressively when provoked. So this is measured with questions like, if someone hits you, how okay is it to hit them back? And this is exactly what we find. Now, what's interesting about this to me is basically everything from here over we already knew. Putting the media in the bedroom is like a turbocharger. It amps up these other effects that we already knew happened. And it's gotten so much harder for you as parents now, because it's not just TVs or video games and computers in the bedroom. They now, you've given them tablets, you've given them phones, and now they have private media that they take into their room. Also probably not a good idea. So I'd say at a minimum, you want to make the bedroom take all media out before bed. If not, even make them media-free zones. Because putting that in the bedroom amplifies all the negative effects that the media can have. Now, what are some of those negative effects? Well, I talked to your high schoolers today about media violence. And this is one of the most studied things in psychology. We've been studying this since the 60s. We have over 1,000 high-quality studies, some of them lasting even 40 years. We know the answer to this. This is not an open question in scientific psychology anymore. It's not, is there an effect? The question is, what type of effect is what type of person going to get more? And what do I mean by that? Well, there are about 19 scientifically documented effects of media violence consumption. I won't worry with all of them. But we can combine them in some interesting ways, one of which is this way. That to the extent that you consume more entertainment violence, people become more willing to behave aggressively. They become more willing to say unkind things, more willing to do road rage behaviors, more willing to push back. The second effect is the victim effect. The more entertainment violence you watch, the more scared you get. Sometimes called the mean world syndrome. You start overestimating how likely you are to be a victim of crime. You start doing more self-protective behaviors like carrying guns to school, which ironically just increases children's odds of being shot. The third effect is the bystander effect. The more you watch, the more desensitized you become. Now, I don't just mean desensitized to other media violence, although that's true. I mean desensitized in the real world. A classic study here, they brought in college-age men. They randomly signed them to watch, if I remember correctly, 20 minutes of a sports program or 20 minutes of a movie that included a simulated rape scene. And then they brought in a real woman who had really been raped. And the men who saw the movie with the simulated rape scene were much more callous toward her, much less sympathetic, much more apathetic to her real human suffering and pain. 20 minutes changed the way they interacted with another human being. That scares me. And the fourth effect is the appetite effect. Simply put, the more you watch, the more you want to watch. There is basically no debate about these. These happen. The more interesting question is what type of person gets which ones in a higher percentage. In general, boys get more of the aggressor, bystander, and appetite. Girls get more of the victim, but no one is unscathed here. As I've examined myself, I have all 4 of them. Now, what about the flip side? What if you're watching pro-social shows, playing pro-social games, where, by which I mean, characters help each other, they care for each other, they show empathy for each other, they care for each other's emotions. Well, it turns out there are 2 main effects of that type of programming. That kids who watch that tend to show more pro-social, helpful, and cooperative behaviors in the real world. And there's an anti-violence effect where their aggressive behavior actually comes down. And once again, these are not just right after watching it, although that's true. But if you watch these types of shows habitually at home, you behave these ways habitually when you're not at home. Now, what if you mix these messages? Say like superheroes. Batman does violent things for pro-social ends. If we take young children, by which I mean up to about age 7 or 8, and we show them shows with only pro-social acts, and then we turn them loose in the room and we just their behaviors. How many helpful and hurtful behaviors do they exhibit toward other children? They show more helpful behaviors than hurtful ones. That makes sense, right? If we show them shows with aggressive acts and then turn them loose, now they show out equal numbers of helpful and harmful behaviors. If, however, we show them shows with both aggressive and pro-social acts, they now show more aggressive, more harmful behaviors than helpful ones. Why? Well, this is a complicated, mixed message we're giving people. Let me reduce it to its simplest. Here's the simplest we can make the idea of Batman. That we socially sanction Batman's limited act of aggression on this alleged criminal perpetrator, because by removing the alleged criminal perpetrator from society, we reduce the greater number of aggressive acts either across time or across people, and so that's why we socially sanction his limited act of vigilante aggression. That's a complicated idea. Young children cannot do that. Young children understand Batman is good, Batman hits people. Therefore, hitting people is good if he's a good guy. And we all think we're the good guys. September 11th terrorists thought they were the good guys too. Now, once kids get to be about age 8, they start being able to understand that complicated mixed message a little bit better. But this is a way parents make a very profound mistake, and it's not because they're bad parents. It's because we don't really know the science behind this. We look at these types of shows like superhero shows, and we look at them with our advanced cognitive powers. And we say, oh, it's a good show because, you know, the villain goes to jail at the end and justice is served. Young children do not understand that message. They cannot. Even if you sit there and try to explain it to them, they basically cannot. There are great studies where they take shows, they chop them up randomly, reorder them. Young children can't tell the difference. They don't get the plot. They certainly cannot do that cognitively complex thing you do, which is you take information you learned later in the show and you rewrap what you learned earlier in the show with it, which is what you're doing when you say, oh, justice is served. So we show kids all sorts of things that they should not be seeing, because we don't remember what it's like to think like a 5-year-old anymore, because you can't. The cognitive development happens. When you move out of one stage, you can't think the old way anymore. So again, not your fault. But it does mean we should be doing things differently with our kids. We should be paying attention maybe to, in this show, there was 25 minutes of fighting is exciting. And there was 2 minutes of, oh, maybe it was bad. What did they learn at a ratio of 25 to 2? What are they going to learn from that? They're going to learn that fighting is exciting. Now, let me show you a little pseudo-experiment we did back when I was director of research at the National Institute on Media and the Family.
We want you to understand tonight that in the eyes of children, or more importantly, in the minds of children, television is always actively teaching something. Always. To prove the point, we brought our television to the Blue Boss Daycare Center. About 10 kids, mostly 2 to 5 years old. And over 2 days, we watched them watch us.
Can you see okay?
We wanted to see if different kinds of programs would get kids to act in different kinds of ways. We had the room rigged, so while they were watching the monitor was watching them. We had cameras in plants, toy boxes, and on the other side of that one-way mirror over there. All of these cameras sent pictures to TV screens upstairs, where we sat with their parents and David Walsh, a psychologist who also runs the National Institute for Media and the Family.
It's at the age that these kids are that they're like sponges. They're learning constantly. All day long, they're learning.
On the first day, we had the kids watch Barney.
Hey, everybody!
The popular public television program with the big purple dinosaur.
Are you ready for the next letter?
The target 2 to 5 age group is drawn in near completely. They sing the songs. We found them literally marching to the beat of this drummer.
Let's go march around the circle.
When those kids started dancing, most of the kids in the group jumped to their feet and started directly imitating what they were seeing.
Teresa's daughter, Hannah, is one way over the top about Barney.
She knows all their names. It's kind of like she
It's
gets to
almost
know
like she
them.
becomes part of that.
She becomes part of the group. Yes.
Yeah.
The kids carry the themes over after the show, playing together peacefully.
I'm proud of the way they're acting.
I'm surprised.
Yeah, I think
Are
they're
you?
acting being good. They're behaving well.
Oh, just wait till you see.
On day 2, it's the Power Rangers. The popular teeny bopper superheroes doing good by beating the living daylights out of anyone doing bad. Starts out calm, even scaring some of the kids into the corner at first. But within minutes, it's become something else altogether. Kids want to be like the Power Rangers so much, they start early, taking dibs on which one best represents them. You might expect kids to act differently, given these 2 shows, but would you really expect this?
You're gonna hurt each other. You better watch what you're doing.
Early on in the show, before all of the action scenes started, they were sitting in a circle, really paying attention. Once the sustained fighting started, that circle is pretty much completely disintegrated.
Oh my goodness. I thought my son was afraid of this movie, and now he's doing the action figure motions.
Remember, here are the kids with Barney, and here are the kids with the Power Rangers.
Actually, it's more than what I expected from the other kids, but my daughter is what I expected. She's not responding at all.
Teresa knows her daughter. She's quite suspicious about the suggestion a simple one-time exposure to a TV program could seriously influence the child she knows so well. But she found out she just had to wait a little longer.
She just kicked Katie. I'm really shocked.
And
It's
that's
the
kind of a
first
shock
time
to
I've
you.
ever seen that.
That sweet little Hannah was within minutes.
My scared little Hannah,
I'm shocked. I knew that they would get up and be active, but I had no idea it was going to be like this. No idea.
This is not my child today. He's not my child.
For some of the parents here, this is not so much eye-opening as it is flat-out disturbing.
How are you going to get rug burn on your face again?
I just feel very nervous that he's reacting this way and that he can react this way so easily to something that he's seen for 20 minutes.
David Walsh argues these kinds of scenes are proof positive kids learn from television.
There are studies that show that babies as young as 14 months old will imitate what they see on a television screen. So it starts early.
Just don't seem as content as they were yesterday.
Just not respecting each other.
The thing that we need to remember as parents is that even though the goal isn't to teach, our kids are learning because they're always learning.
Now, there are 2 things that fascinate me about this. The first is the use of the word again in the sentence, Carl, you're going to get rug burn on your face again. That kid party's hard. And the second is little Hannah. Why did little Hannah start punching and kicking? Did TV make her start punching and kicking? What we might call peer pressure, although no peers are pressuring her. Right? In fact, what I love is her mom saying, my child's not affected at all. At the same moment, Hannah's digging for the hammer she's going to go hit it. What we see here actually is this is one of the rare times you actually get to see the multiple layers of the effect happening. For most, it was a simple one-on-one. They saw it, they started talking, but not little Hannah. What influenced her was her community changed. One day, what was acceptable normative behavior in that room was sharing, caring, respectful, polite play. The next day was punching, kicking, aggressive play. What changed the norm in the room? TV. And that was powerful enough to bring everyone along with it. This also teaches us an interesting thing about peer pressure. Because often we ask questions about, why do kids do things? Why do teenagers smoke? And we go, peer pressure. And we stand back smugly as if we've said something important. That doesn't answer the question at all. Where did the peers learn it? Because I promise you, no peer came up with the idea of growing tobacco, drying and processing, infusing with chemicals, chopping it up, wrapping it in paper, lighting it on fire, inhaling the smoke, and thinking that's cool. No peer came up with that idea. Where did the peers get the idea? It would be cool to smoke. Oh wait, now we're back to the again. So anytime you ever hear yourselves utter the word peer pressure, for the rest of your life, I want you to kick yourselves. And go one step farther. Where did the peers get it? Because it's not actually answering the question when we say peer pressure. This is a study we did with 600 and some 8th and 9th grade students. We measured how much they play violent video games. We also then looked at several things about them. This first one, hostile attribution bias, here's your next psychological jargon. Hostile attribution bias, we all know people who when something annoying happens, they give the other person the benefit of the doubt, right? They let it roll off their back. We also know people who take everything very personally. This is more like that, where you have a bias for attributing hostility to other people's actions. So when something annoying happens to you, you think they meant to do it, right? And the whole time you're playing a violent video game, you're practicing a hostile attribution bias because you're constantly vigilant for something about to jump out at you and be aggressive toward you. So what we see is kids who play more violent video games also see the world in terms of hostility. They have this hostile attribution bias. They get more arguments with teachers. That's a real world antisocial behavior. They get more physical fights. That's a real world aggressive behavior. And they get worse grades. Now, if you're a good skeptic, and I want you to be, you're going to say, no, that's not necessarily about playing violent games. That might be about being a naturally hostile and aggressive kid. It's a naturally hostile kid. They play more violent video games. They see the world in terms of hostility. They get more arguments. They get more fights. They get worse grades. All that's true. So we measured their personality trait hostility in this study. And if we split them into quartiles, and we take the 25% least naturally aggressive kids, and they also play the least amount of violent video games, only 4% of them have been involved in a physical fight in the past year. It makes sense. They're not naturally aggressive kids, they're not playing violent games, they're not getting any fights. But if we take these same low hostile kids, again, these are the least naturally aggressive kids, but they play a lot of violent video games, it's an almost 10 times increase in their risk of getting into a fight. How about the other extreme? We take the 25% most naturally aggressive kids. These are the ones we expect to be getting into fights. Well, if they don't play violent video games, 28% of them have been involved in a fight in the past year, and if they do, that's a bad combination. Now, what we see here that fascinates me is these two bars. Notice the least naturally aggressive kids are more likely to get into fights than the most naturally aggressive kids if they're playing violent video games and they aren't. But what we're really seeing here is stacking of risk factors. Yes, being a naturally hostile kid matters. Yes, playing violent video games matters. But matters more than either of them when you start putting those together. And now we start getting people to predict. In fact, I just need to know about 3 or 4 things about the kids, and I can predict with about 94% accuracy if they're going to get in a fight next year. And their media violence is one of those things that I measured. Now, in this study, we separated out how much time they're playing from whether they're playing violent games. Because not every kid plays violent games. Some kids play play other types of games. And what we see is really interesting. If they're spending a lot of time playing, they're getting worse grades. But notice there's no direct path from amount of play and antisocial and aggressive behaviors. But because kids who play a lot tend to play more violent games, those two things come together to change their personalities, to become more hostile kids, which in turn relates to all 3 of those outcomes. But even though we're above that mediated pathway, if they're playing violent games, that adds extra predictive bonus to whether they're likely to get into physical fights. Parents tend to care about one of 2 things: how much time their kids spend with media, or what the content is. Data like these show that both matter, but they matter for different reasons. Amount of time seems to be related to things like school performance, risk of addiction, video-induced seizures, and lower physical activity and higher weight gain. Whereas content is very content-specific. If they're consuming violent media, then their aggression, their thoughts and feelings and leaks out into their behaviors after a while goes up. But if they're doing pro-social shows and games, then in fact they become less aggressive and more pro-social in their behaviors. The good news in this study was that kids who said their parents always check the ratings before allowing them to buy, or back when there was a renting of games, that doesn't happen much anymore. Those kids are getting into fewer fights, those kids are getting better grades. So again, if you're a good skeptic, you're going to say that's not necessarily about checking ratings on the box. That's about being a more involved, better parent. My answer, I don't care. Because you can't just tell parents, be better. You have to tell them how. There's a rating on every game. Learn it, use it, and all of a sudden you've made them more involved, better parents. Now, this is a complicated set. These are longitudinal latent growth curves. I will walk you through it. This is 3,000 children followed across 3 years. And the I is the intercept. Where do they start at the beginning of the study in year 1? The S is the slope. How do they change over the 3 years of the study? So here is their violent game exposure. If they're playing violent games, down here we have aggressive cognition. We measured 3 types of aggressive cognition in this study. We measured hostile attribution bias. You've already heard about that. The other one is normative beliefs about aggression. You've heard about that, how acceptable you think it is to behave aggressively when provoked. And the third one is aggressive fantasies. How much you like to hurt other people, how much time you spend thinking about things like that. And of course, the whole time you're playing a violent video game, you're practicing aggressive fantasies. And the whole time you're playing a violent video game, you're also getting rewarded for behaving aggressively, which increases your normative beliefs. And that's exactly what you see here, is that kids who started the study playing a lot of violent games also start with higher aggressive cognitions of these 3 types. If they change to play more violent video games, they also change to have more aggressive cognitions. Why does aggressive cognition matter? Because it starts linking out into behavior, and those kids start being the more aggressive kids by year 3 of the study. There's also this long-term effect, even for where they started, giving extra predictive power to their aggressive behaviors. I want you to imagine what this looks like in the real world. Yes, it takes a geek like me who loves the statistics, but let's think about what this really means. Let's take this kid who's been playing a lot of violent video games, or watching a lot of violent movies and TV shows, or watching a lot of violent TikToks. It kind of doesn't matter what it is. That's one of the surprises in this research, is that we thought video games would be a much bigger effect than TV or movies. It's not. It's about the same size effect. But he gets bumped in the school hallway. There's a tiny little change in perception because he's spent all this time being hyper-vigilant for aggression in these games. He stops assuming it was an accident. He starts assuming the other kid meant to do it, or the other kid meant to make me angry, or something like that, right? That tiny change in perception shifts everything downstream from it. Another thing that you practice in a violent video game is the minute you see an aggressive stimulus, you quickly reorient your attention toward it. So this kid's going to quickly turn to see the kid who bumped him, right? And he's going to call to mind a response. What should he do? Well, the thing that humans do most of the time, especially if they're under stress, is the thing they've practiced the most. Here's your next psychological jargon. It's called the availability heuristic. What becomes available to your mind is the thing you practice the most. And the thing, if they've been playing lots of violent video games, watching lots of violent movies, the thing that they practice the most is an aggressive response to an aggressive stimulus. So he's going to think he should do something. He should say something mean or push back, right? But even if it comes to your mind isn't enough to make you do it. Because it's kind of a high bar. Because if he does push back, the odds that this turns into a fight in the school hallway skyrocket. But because he's been rewarded for behaving aggressively in all these games, that bar has been lowered. And you can now see how the odds have shifted that make it far more likely that a fight will break out in the school hallway. Now here's the interesting thing. When that fight does break out, no one is going to think it's about games. You've all been taught the wrong way to think about this. You think kids are copying. They're not copying the aggression. For 3-year-olds, copy. Your middle schoolers and high schoolers do not copy. What way this effect works is it changes the way you see the world. It changes the way you think. And you take the way you see the world and the way you think with you everywhere. And it just subtly shifts the odds, making it more likely that your child will get into more aggressive encounters. That's the way the effect really works. You have not been taught this because whenever it comes out in the media, it's always about a school shooting. Are you making our kids shooters? No, they're not. Because to get to that level of aggression, you have to have lots of risk factors. So take the killers of Columbine. They had uninvolved parents, they had easy access to weapons, they had been bullied, they had psychiatric illnesses, and they consumed a lot of media violence. Is that the one that broke that camel's back? I don't know. I do know if we'd taken it away, this would have gone down. Enough? I don't know. But it's one of the things we actually can control. Now, I've been talking about this from the side of increased aggressive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. That's not the only way this effect works. Let me show you a little pseudo-experiment I got to do with Super Nanny back when I had hair.
Earlier in the program, Joe Professor Doug Gentile revealed that playing a simulated war game for 20 minutes is enough to desensitize a child to real-life violence.
Now Joe wants to see if it can also change their behaviour. Will letting your child play violent games make them less empathetic and helpful to others? The boys are still in two groups. 20 are playing a violent war game, and the other 20 a non-violent football game. Joe will observe while Doug interviews a random sample from each group.
So we've got Doug sitting down already.
Each boy will be asked a series of questions. During the interview, Doug will intentionally knock a cup of pens over to see how the players respond. Will the violent players react in the same way as the non-violent players? The first candidate for interview is one of the non-violent football gamers.
Hi, I'm Doug. Have a seat. Just have a couple of questions for you right now, and then we might talk to you again a little bit later on. But do you play games at your home?
Yeah.
Yeah? What game systems do you have?
Just PS2.
And what would you say are your 3 favorite games? Sure.
Doug's theory is that the non-violent gamers will help, but the violent gamers won't. Joe is not so sure.
See, when Doug went to go and pick him up, then the politeness kicked in and he said, "Oh, do you want a hand?" There wasn't an immediate reaction. And I think purely that was because he's a polite boy. I don't think it was because he played football. I'm not quite convinced yet.
So what happens with a boy who played the violent war game?
What are your 3 very favorites?
Call of Duty World at War.
And another.
And what would you say are your 3 very favorite games? Oh, well, either. Just 3 favorite to play.
And another violent gamer.
Very favorite games.
Call of Duty.
But what about a non-violent game player?
To play.
Nice.
And another.
And what would you say are your 3 favorite games?
Pick 'em up.
So far, all 4 non-violent gamers have volunteered to pick up the pens. But what if we go back to the violent gamers?
Actually, I think he gave less a reaction than anyone I've seen.
Overall, only 40% of the violent gamers picked up the pens. But an incredible 80% of the non-violent gamers all stepped in to help Doug.
Thanks.
So, yeah, if they play the violent game, like I say, it just changes the way you see the world. They didn't even see that they could help. Whereas if they played the soccer game, 80% of them would help. Not only that, I counted how many pens they picked up. So it's not that no one who played Call of Duty helped, but only 40% of them did. And when they did help, they still picked up fewer pens. They were less helpful, even when they were helping, than the ones who had played the non-violent game. What if they're playing pro-social games? I'm not going to go into all these details, but basically we've done these studies in now 8 different countries. Again, thousands of kids. We see that if they're playing pro-social games or watching pro-social TV shows and movies, they are more helpful and less hurtful. If they play violent games or watch violent shows, they are more hurtful and less helpful. And again, in Western countries, East European countries, Asian countries, we see exactly the same thing. Basically, why does this effect happen? What we seem to see in our data is that as you're consuming pro-social media, you're learning to care for other people. And so you feel more empathy. And now that empathy shows up and you're more willing to do helpful and cooperative behaviors. So it's not that the media are bad. It's that they're powerful. And we can control a lot of that power. One of the newer things on the stage in research is what is globally called video game addiction. The US has called it internet gaming disorder in the DSM-5, but it's not an official diagnosis in the US. It is now an official diagnosis in most of the rest of the world. The World Health Organization has added gaming disorder as a bona fide mental health disorder. When does it become a disorder? It's when you're gaming. It's not about how much you do it. It's about, is it disrupting other areas of your life? That's true for any addiction. A lot of people drink a lot, and somehow they still keep their marriages intact and get their work done and things like that. So it's not about how much. It's when does it start damaging your family life? You start arguing with your child about it. And when does it start damaging their social life because they stop doing, they stop being interested in clubs or sports or music or other things they used to be interested in, and their grades start slipping. Now that's an addiction, and they need help. And the problem is they can't easily get it yet because the U.S. is lagging behind the rest of the world in naming this a bona fide mental health disorder. But it is a real thing, and I expect in DSM-6, and I'm on that committee helping to advise the American Psychiatric Association, I expect that it will enter as a bona fide mental health disorder in DSM-6. That's several years from now. And so that means lots of kids are not getting the help they need today. But I want you to know that it's a real thing, and if your kid's having problems, they should go see a specialist, a therapist in either substance use disorders or obsessive compulsive disorders. They can't be diagnosed with it because it's not an official diagnosis in the US, but those types of therapists would be good at treating it. How prevalent is it? Well, we did a national study several years ago with Harris polls. I got Harris polls to collect data from me. So a beautiful nationally representative sample of 1,200 kids, basically 8 to 18 across the US. And we found that about 90% of them play video games, that's no surprise. And of them, 8.5% would be classified as addicted by this clinical standard. Is that a small number? Is that a big number? More recent numbers put it down a little lower at about 5 or 6%, rather than 8%. But there are about 40 million children, 8 to 18 in the US. If 90% of them play games and 5% of them would meet this clinical standard for addiction, that is millions of children taking serious damage to their lives because of the way they're playing. Now, how do you know if your science is making an impact in the world? Well, when Jimmy Fallon talks about it, he said, a new study shows that about 1 out of every 10 kids who plays video games is addicted. You know what they really need is rehab. That rehab's such an awesome game. It's on Xbox and PlayStation. I played it for 6 hours yesterday. Sissy, these kids are playing way more than 6 hours a day. Again, we did a study, 3,000 kids across 3 years, and we measured their addiction symptoms and a bunch of other things. Because you might imagine, maybe it's not the games, maybe the games aren't the problem. Maybe these kids aren't doing well in school, they don't have a lot of friends, they get depressed. They go home and they game a lot to cope with it. And so actually the gaming is a symptom of the depression, right? And of course, the more time they spend gaming, they're not making more friends, their grades aren't going to get better, so they get more depressed, so they game more. So they get more depressed, so they game more. Maybe that's what's happening. That's actually the opposite of what we found. What we find is that at year 1, kids who are more impulsive, have lower social confidence, and are spending more time gaming, they have more pathological gaming symptoms. At the end of the study, the kids who became addicted got more depressed, more anxious, more social phobia, worse grades. If they stopped, because as we saw, measure them for these 3 years, some of the kids started addicted but stopped being addicted. If they stopped being addicted, their depression lifted, their anxiety lifted, their social phobia lifted. So it actually looks like the gaming is leading the other mental health problems. Now, I can't say that for sure because we measure them once a year. So I don't actually know the temporal resolution of when these things happen. But what I do know is that mental health disorders tend to beget other mental health disorders. If you start with anxiety, you're probably going to get depression. And if you start with depression, you're probably going to get anxiety because that's just the way mental health is. It's called comorbidity, that one thing pushes the other and they start pushing each other. And so the question of which one started it actually is a dumb question. Because the therapist, if all they do is figure out which one started it, and that's the only thing they treat, the kid's not going to get better. They have to treat the whole package of all the comorbid problems. So I think that's what these data truly show, is that gaming is its own problem, but it actually pushes these other things around, and they probably push it around. It's not brain science. Oh wait, yes it is. And it's brain science we've known for 2,500 years. Your grandmother was a great neuroscientist. She told you practice makes perfect. She was right. So let me end with this thought experiment. What is a dream we humans have had for thousands of years? Well, it's to have our children grow up healthier and safer in the world, right? Let me tell you the good news. We have achieved this dream. Let me show you some data to prove it. Just imagine the amazing time in which we live. I know politicians love to tell you everything's gone to hell. That's not true. We're actually in the least violent time. You know, crime rates are actually way down from where they were 50 years ago. We're actually doing much better than people want you to know for whatever reason. First of all, deaths by preventable disease have dropped amazingly, especially from the most dangerous substance on the planet. You know what the most dangerous substance on the planet kills more people than any other thing? Water. We now have cleaner, better water all over the planet, and far fewer people are dying from waterborne diseases. Medicine's patented by year just keep going up and up and up. Life expectancy has been going up and up. It's starting to drop again, but it's still very high relative to where it used to be. What is it that makes us happy? Well, is it money? Is it roller coasters? Is it bacon? Beer? TV? Well, we have lots of those, but are we actually happier as a society? Well, the research on money makes it very clear that even though the amount of money the average household has gone up and up and up since the 50s, all the happiness surveys have not changed a bit. More money doesn't really make us happier. Now, up to a point, if you're really in poverty and you get out of poverty, that does make you happier. But beyond that, more money doesn't make us happier. And that's not just in the US, that's across every country basically it's ever been measured in, as far as I know. We don't even make the top 10 in terms of happiness. Despite we're number one in roller coasters. And we're number one in TV viewing. We watch way more TV than any other country in the world. There's no relationship between cell phone ownership and happiness. There's no relation between number of TVs and happiness. There is a correlation. There is one here between beer consumption and happiness. But it's a very small correlation. But it's not zero. The other ones are all zero. When we actually ask people detailed questionnaires, the people who say that they are happier in their lives give more priority to love and relationships than to money. And when we look at how much time people spend in social activities and we correlate that with how happy they are, how stressed they are in the world, the more time you spend per day with others being social, you are much happier, much less anxious. Now the problem is if we've got our kids spending over 50 hours a week on screens, they're not getting that social time. Survey of 1,000 adults found that we spend 6 hours of every week feeling completely and utterly bored with our lives. That's 3 years of our life that we say, oh, we're so bored. And when we ask them, what is it that makes you so bored? Well, I don't have money, and I have to wait in lines, and I don't like hearing people whine about feeling ill. Wow, what an uncompassionate race we've become. What a selfish race we've become. Because you think you're supposed to be entertained all the time. There's nothing wrong with being bored. It's where insight comes from. It's where creativity comes from. But we don't allow ourselves enough time being bored to get to those anymore. Why? We've trained our brains to require constant external stimulation. And it starts early. Here is data with parents of 2- and 3-year-olds who sometimes use media to help regulate their child's whining, so they give them a tablet or something or they let them watch TV to help calm down. It turns out that just makes these kids much worse. In the moment, they calm down, and so you think that's a win. It's not. You're training them actually to think that their emotions are something they're supposed to get away from You're training them that the external world controls their emotions. That's not what controls your emotions, by the way. Here's my favorite study I ever did, and this is the good news. We studied 1,300 3rd through 5th graders here in Iowa and Minnesota. We talked to the kids, we talked to their parents, we talked to their teachers, we talked to their school nurses. We got a lot of data about these families. And we measured them multiple times across the school year. And we asked the parents and the kids, by the way, does their family have rules for how much time you're allowed to be on different media? Does your family have rules about what types of things you're allowed to watch or consume or play? And when parents say they do have more of these types of rules, those kids actually are consuming lower amounts of screen time and they're getting lower violent media exposure. When we follow these kids out to the end of the school year, those kids whose parents say they have more limits on screen time and content of screen media, those kids are getting better sleep, which in turn lowers their BMI and the risk for obesity. They're getting better grades in school. They're more pro-social in their behaviors as rated by teachers, which is remarkable because the teachers don't know what your rules of home are for media, but they can see the behaviors your kids exhibit. They're less aggressive also as rated by teachers. Now there are two things that fascinate me about this. These are not the same types of outcome variables. We've got physical health and school performance and social wellness. Those three types of outcome variables don't usually co-occur like this. But this one simple thing of setting limits on amount and content of media influences all of them. It's a ripple effect that extends out wide and across time because this is across the school year. So it's a very powerful protective factor for children. But that's not even the most interesting thing here. Here's the most interesting thing. You will never know you're having this effect. Because you're never going to know that your child is gaining less weight than he would have, or is getting better grades than she would have, or is more pro-social than he would have been. You only can see what your child is. You don't know what they would have been if you had relaxed the rules. So what can you see for yourself? You can see the fight over the rules. And this is why parents feel powerless, because they can see the fighting over the rules, but they can't tell what a beneficial effect they're actually having by holding those rules. I'm here to tell you, you are in a much more powerful position than you realize. Setting limits on amount and content of children's screen media is a powerful protective factor across a wide range of health and wellness indicators. And so I need you to share this information with the other parents in this district, because you few who showed up here tonight, you're not the ones I'm worried about. So let me stop here and take questions. I believe there's a microphone that will be handed around if you've got questions.
I don't need a microphone, I have teacher voice.
Okay, go ahead, teacher voice.
All over this, you mentioned it earlier, but it probably bears repeating, if this assumption is correct. You talked about screens, content on screens, and gaming.
Yep.
But the number one for kids now is cell phones.
Yep.
Because it's all of those wrapped into one.
Yep. What's your question?
That was my question. My question was the screens. This is games is cell phones now. Yes.
So the correct scientific answer is it takes 10 to 20 years for the research to catch up to whatever new technology is. We don't have the data, or we're just starting to get data on phones. There is no reason to believe it's any better. There is only one reason I can think of to expect it might be worse, and that's the privatization of it, right? Because now it's like you take it to your room and set turbocharging to the other effects. And parents aren't able to see what they're watching, so you can't monitor as well, you can't limit it as well. So it's a much harder job for you as parents, there is no doubt, than I had when my kids were young. So, but let me give you why I think there's not really any important difference other than the privatization and the harder job you have monitoring. When video games started taking off in the late 90s, especially violent games, and early 2000s, there were a lot of theoretical reasons why we expected they would have a much bigger effect, violent games, much bigger effect than movies or TV did. I'll just go through some of those reasons. One, you're an active participant. We do know from other research that the more actively involved you are, the better you learn it, right? You are getting rewarded for behaving aggressively, whereas a movie doesn't reward you in the same way. You have to take the point of view of the aggressor, especially in a first-person shooter. Whereas in a movie, you might identify, and identification matters a lot. And if you identify with the victim, you're actually less likely to behave aggressive after watching that movie. But in a violent game, you're forced to take the position of the aggressor. So there are other theoretical reasons. So we expect that violent video games would have much stronger effect than TV or movies. We're not finding that. 20 years of research, it's the same, it's about, my colleague Craig Anderson at Iowa State thinks it's a little higher. It's like 2 percentage points higher. I think that's within the margin of error. He thinks maybe it's a meaningful difference. It's not much though. In contrast, violent reading books with violence does not have the same effect. Violent music doesn't have the same effect. It's not nearly as strong an effect. But once you put it on the screen, and we did one study I've never published where we had people watching violent or non-violent rap, listening to rap music with violent or non-violent lyrics, and they also watched the same music video of those. And we had them, it was a complicated design where they watched one video and they listened to one song, and one of them was violent and non-violent, and across people, they had all these combinations of that. And then we gave them a measure of aggressive cognition, how easily aggressive ideas came to their mind. If they just listened to the song, and we gave them the lyric sheet, right? So it's not like they can't understand the lyrics. So they saw the lyrics in all these cases. If they listened to the song, they didn't have an increase in aggressive cognition. If they watched the music video of that same song, they had a big increase in their aggressive cognition. The minute you put it on the screen, for some reason, it has a much larger effect than other types of media. But the difference between TV, movies, video games, absolutely negligible. They're about the same effect size in statistical terms. And I expect that's exactly what we'll find when we start looking in detail at small screens that they're watching. Because again, they're also playing the same games. They're also watching the same movies and TV shows and things on their phone that they could on TV or with the console nowadays too. It's a good question. Yes, down here. You want to bring it to the mic?
So I have two teenagers at home. And
I'm so sorry. I did too at one point.
And they're boys.
You'll get through it. You'll get through it.
I was a parent that allowed them to game a lot, especially during COVID.
COVID changed a lot of things.
Yeah. Now, I would say in the last 2 years, I've gotten really aggressive on, I got to Bark. I don't know if you're familiar with Bark, but they monitor phones and screen time and computers and that kind of stuff, which is great at home. But when they leave home and they come to school and I see snaps all day long, and I don't know how to say my question, but
how do you manage that?
Yeah, and I know they're still completely addicted, even though I turn off their phones at 9 o'clock at night. I still get a lot of fighting and all that stuff, but they're very addicted to their phones. It's their way of socializing, they say.
So, first of all, the school makes a difference. Let me give you. This is why we have these types of nights, because the school needs you to partner with them. The teachers see the problems. They need you to do things differently at home when they see the problems. You see the teachers, you need to know what support you need from them. So this is a partnership. That's when education works best. You're highly involved in their education, and there's good communication between you and their teachers. So this is a thing that, again, if you're seeing snaps all day long, well, maybe the school needs a different policy about phone use at school. Because they really do not need a phone at school. In my opinion, this is an opinion. Although there are starting to be data showing that schools have gone to no phones, those grades have gone up, the kids are happier. There's great studies out of France showing that. There's starting to be some in the US and limited school districts. So it actually does seem, the kids hate it at first, and then they get happier later. So that's one answer. Here's the other answer. I talked about setting limits on amount and content. There are actually four main ways that parents can monitor and be involved in their kids' media in the literature. The first one is co-viewing or co-playing. You can watch with your kid or play with your kid. The second is restrictions on amount of time. The third is restrictions on the content. And the fourth is what's known in the literature as active mediation. What is this? This is when you spend time discussing the media they watch. Why do you watch what you do? Why don't you watch what you don't? What effect does this have when people watch this? How do you feel after watching it? Whose point of view is being shown? Whose point of view isn't being shown? What are they trying to get you to feel by this? I mean, it's that deep level of critical analysis that you weren't trained to do unless you took a critical media theory class in college. So most parents don't do it because they weren't trained to do it. And if you ask parents, do you talk to your kids about the media they watch? And they say yes, usually what they mean is they say their opinions. I don't like that. That's really low quality active mediation. Active mediation is done best with questions. And getting the kids to learn how to do critical reasoning about what they're watching. So, I'm telling you this in more detailed view because 3 of these, the research shows, are fantastic for kids. Even if you don't do the active mediation, you've already seen limits on amount and content, powerful protective factor. The best one is the active mediation, though. When you sit and you watch with your kids and talk to them about what they're seeing and hearing, it seems to mitigate almost all of the negative effects. Let me say that again. When you sit and you watch with your kids and you talk to them in this critical viewing way about what they're seeing and hearing, it mitigates almost all of the negative effects. It also enhances the positive effects. Now here's the caveat. If you sit and watch or play with them but don't discuss it, it enhances the negatives. Co-viewing is bad unless you pair it with active mediation. Why? Because if you sit there and watch with them and don't critically analyze it with them, you're giving your silent approval to it just by being there. So anything that they say, all the carnage on the screen, you've just now approved by watching it with them. So, active mediation is another powerful benefit, because at some point your kid's going to go to someone else, Johnny's house, and they're going to see something you never in a million years would have let them see, right? If you're in the habit of having this discussion with your kids, and it's much easier to start when they're young and just make it a habit than it is to start with them when they're teenagers, but it's still probably worth trying to do as teenagers. They come home and they tell you what they saw. And now you get another chance to talk about it with them and help them process it the way that fits your family's values. There are other real benefits to this, actually, that you wouldn't think of it. Like, no parent wants to have that sex talk with their kids. And no kid wants to have that sex talk with their parents. Why not? Because it feels like you're pointing your finger at them. It feels very personal and intimidating. But if you're in the habit of talking about these things that you see together, you can use what you see at the media out there, and you point your finger out there, and you say, in this movie, these two characters jumped into bed without any discussion of protection, without any discussion of what it might mean for their relationship. What do you think about that? And now you get to have the talk without it being so threatening, because you're talking about that show or that movie, rather than talking about them. And you get to impart your family's values in a much gentler way. So the active mediation actually is the very best of all these monitoring strategies. It's also the hardest because we haven't been trained how to do it. We haven't been trained to critically analyze the media ourselves. So it's hard for us to do, hard for us to model. But that's another way that, yes, they're going to do things outside of your control. But if you've already got this relationship where you discuss these things, you still get some control over it even after they've done the thing you really allowed them to do. There's a question back there.
We'll do one more question, and then I think we will have to wrap it up for the evening. I would guess the high schoolers helping with the child care are anxiously awaiting the parents' return.
I'm sure that's true.
there been studies of adults looking at similar parameters as we discussed in this talk?
And second question?
Second question is your thoughts on use of school computers during the school day and as well as needing to use them at home and needing.
Okay, good questions. Adults are affected exactly the same way. Why? We have the same brains they do. Children aren't actually that different from us. Adults have more protective factors, so we don't see things leak out into behavior the same way, or not as easily, because we have more ways of coping with our negative emotions. So the studies on media violence show exactly the same effect, psychologically and in the brain as with kids. But we're less likely to, we get less and less aggressive as we get older. If by aggressive you mean willing to hit. The most aggressive people on the planet are 3-year-olds. It's true, in terms of willing to hit. They're not good at it, which is good for us. But we actually get less and less aggressive. But that doesn't mean these psychological processes from what we consume, they still, I mean, and the easy way to prove this is you sit down to watch a movie. If I ask you at the end what happened, you can tell me. You learned. You weren't trying to learn. It's in your brain. There's no, all these effects, or almost all these effects, the addiction might be a little, are about learning. And whatever you put in front of you, you will learn. And if you do it over and over, you'll learn it really well to the point where it's burned into your brain and never going to be forgotten. And so if you examine yourself, if you're the type of person who watches a lot of violent movies and plays violent games, you will notice that you're probably a little quicker to anger. You'll probably notice you're more willing to flip a person off if they cut you off in the road. You're probably more willing to call people nasty names. To you, you're not going to think that's about what you consume. That's just going to feel natural, because it is natural to you now. Because you've practiced enough, it's become natural. So the effects on adults are actually not different, other than we have other ways of coping that younger children don't have yet. Your second question was? Schools and school computers. Okay, so when we're talking about screen time, it's very important to separate out school or work use from entertainment use. And all the data I've talked about here are about entertainment use, right? So if the American Academy of Pediatrics used to recommend no more than 1 hour total entertainment screen time, so that's everything. That's video games, movies, DVDs, Snapchat, all of it. No more than 1 hour a day for elementary school children, and no more than 2 hours a day for secondary school age children. I think those are pretty good recommendations. As you can tell from the actual data, kids are nowhere near that. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you get it down that far, but still if you're reducing it, that's going to be helpful. But if they're, and what the American Academy of Pediatrics also made clear, is if they're using computers or things like that for school, that's okay, that's fine, that's actually functional, right? And if they need to use it at home for school purposes or for work purposes, if you have teenagers, that's also okay, that's free. It's the entertainment media that almost all of these data are talking about. Now there is another philosophical question about what does it mean when we hand our kids, when we have our schools hand our kids a computer, or I'm seeing now, first graders being handed tablets by schools. Well, you've just told the kid, in essence, that this media is so important that even schools want you to use it. I'm not sure that's the message we really want to be giving our kids. So I've been fighting this since, I don't know if you remember, the computers in the classroom of the 80s. The research shows that once the computers got in the classroom, actually grades went down. It's worse than having a good teacher, just with no computer in the classroom. And then we moved to, I don't know if you remember, Channel 1, where schools were getting TVs in their classrooms as long as they showed some advertising to the kids every year. And then we got to, now we're at 1-to-1. The research always lags 20 years behind, but basically I expect we're going to find that actually it's made their learning much worse. So, I know you're all sitting there, but they have to learn this. They're going to grow up in a technological world. There's no way they won't learn it. There's no possible way they won't learn it. Especially if they need to for their job. So we don't need to be giving it to them at a young age. So I am philosophically opposed to schools handing out computers, at least until high school. But, given that that's not the world we really live in, then we should be teaching them how to use them so they're maximizing the benefits and minimizing the harm. If we just hand them to them and say, go nuts, they will. And that's not what we really want. But if they're actually using it for real educational purposes, that's great. That's getting the benefits out of it. Because I'm not saying we should take all these media away from kids and never let them have them, then we lose the benefits. What I'm saying is we're really unbalanced as a culture. We have not taught anyone how to set limits such that we're maximizing the benefits while at the same time minimizing the harms. And that's what I'd like us to be doing a better job of. And the schools can really help in that, but only if they get the support from the legislature, which has actually gone backwards in terms of requiring things like media literacy education in the schools. So I was not doing so great these days in education. And we can't just keep blaming the teachers and administrators for that. We should be pushing our legislators to actually be doing more for our schools. But that's my political stance, it's not a scientific one. And I try to be very clear what's science and what's my opinion. And that's just my opinion. And worth every bit paid for. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gentile. Like to just once again take an opportunity to thank Myrtue for partnering with us on this. Jade Albertson is not in here right now, but she was a huge component of helping us get Dr. Gentile, helping us bridge the communication between the hospital and the schools. So if you see Jade or know Jade, it would be really great. I would appreciate it if you would give her some kudos, because without her, she's been with Dr. Gentile all day, helping him out, getting him around, getting this all coordinated. So give her a shout out, that would be great.
And share this information. The media are never going to tell you the truth about the science, because only 5 companies own 90% of media. That means the newspapers own video game companies, they own movies, movie distribution, music and music distribution, magazines, and television stations. So why would their news division tell you something that would harm the profits of their movie and game divisions? You need to share this information in your community, what the real science is.
Yes, please. Thank you.